Welcome to the Only Dream Big podcast, starring your host Donnie Bedney. Donnie is the president of PSP Metrics and has been in the assessment and human capital management industry for more than 15 years. Get ready as Donnie, together with industry experts, share how you can create better workplaces, improve employee experiences, and ultimately drive change through people.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Only Dream Big pod. I am your host, Donnie Bedney, and so excited to have my next guest with us, Don MacPherson. Don, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thanks for having me, Donnie. I'm excited to have this conversation.
I think there is no doubt that based on like our pre-brief conversation and all of that there are going to be a number of nuggets, gems, like insert synonym that will be dropped today. So excited to kind of hop in. But can you tell our listeners a little bit more about the work that you do at 12 Geniuses?
Sure. 12 Geniuses is comprised of three components. There's the podcast, which is named 12 Geniuses. And I go around the world and interview geniuses about trends shaping the way we live and work. We've now put out 6 seasons of the podcast, been doing that for the last 4 years. And tomorrow I will start with our first Futurist Friday series that's running over the summer. So I'm talking with 12 futurists over the course of the summer. And the idea behind it is to help leaders, business leaders, become better visionaries for their organizations. So I'm talking with these futurists around how they vet their sources, what is a can't miss podcast or author that they won't miss. We talk about what trends they're following and that sort of thing. So really to help our audience become better visionaries and forward thinking in their organizations. So that's the first part of the company. And then I do public speaking on these trends. So companies will hire me to talk about 12 trends that are shaping the 2020s. And then the last part is I do consulting, helping organizations improve their employee experience. So it's those three things. And as I shared with you just a moment ago, we are now at the point of monetizing the podcast. So I'm very excited about that as well.
Really good. Absolutely. Absolutely. And it seems just so intertwined, right? All of those things. How do you, just curious, how do you define futurist? So how would you define someone as a futurist?
Well, it's an actual title, and people get an AFP degree, I think, or a certificate, which is a certified futurist.
Sure.
And there's a community of these people out there. I am not one of them. I talk with a lot of them. Okay. But they go out and they study these trends, and there's models that they use to identify trends and pick up on signals. So it's an actual occupation.
Okay.
Yeah, and they're brilliant.
Oh my gosh!
Amazingly brilliant people and accurate. That's what's so crazy about it is, if you look back at history, you'll see a guy like Ray Kurzweil, who predicted mobile technologies decades in advance. And, the ideas that he had years ago are, very close to what actually happened. And so, if you think about some of the things that people are predicting now around where artificial intelligence will be in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, it's mind blowing. Humanity is on the precipice of dramatic changes.
Yeah. Funny enough, the timing of our conversation, I had a tweet the other day because I've had some thoughts about the difference between like a thought leader and a futurist for a little while. And I've defined a futurist as someone who knows a whole lot and basically has a very clear understanding of the current state of the world. And then also utilizing that to then push everyone towards the future and where we should be. But I view a thought leader as someone who knows a whole lot about what used to be true and just enough about what's currently going on to be dangerous. And the fact that and the tweet was like, we need more futurists and fewer thought leaders, especially at this really unique time that we're living through, right? I believe, and we talked about this a little bit before, but I believe that we're living through a black swan event. And so if that is the case, then everything BC before COVID, is almost irrelevant based on like a significant shift in values that we're seeing and all of that. And so how can organizations, really, where can they point to? Who can they depend on? Don MacPherson and others,
Well,
in order to really, get more of a grasp of the current state of the world as they're thinking about the type of organization and culture that they want to build, in the future. So, just seems like that's something that you are constantly having conversations with others about, and probably talking to organizations about as well.
it is. It absolutely is. And I have a couple of comments based on what you said. And I think your definition of a futurist is accurate. The thing that I would add to that is most of the futurists I talk to have a very, very good sense of the past and will draw on that sense of the past to make sense of the present and the future. And so that's something that a lot of the changes that we go through are cyclical. And so having an understanding of the past is important. And so even with our political divide, it's things that we have experienced in the past.
Sure.
Not necessarily with the technological capabilities that we have today, but we have gone through these. We have had these divisions in the past. And so looking at that is important. And the other thing I will say is regarding to BC, the comment on BC before COVID, I really view COVID as an accelerant.
Agreed.
We were going to evolve into working from home, but COVID just made it happen really quickly. We were going to have mental health challenges, but COVID really amplified those mental health challenges. And so it's been an accelerant on a lot of different fronts that I think is really amazing and quite positive in a lot of ways. And obviously it has been negative and challenging for a lot of people, a lot of organizations and countries, frankly.
Yeah. No, and spot on, my friend. I mean, one of the things I know that I was reading prior to, as you talk about, mental health, mental wellness, loneliness apparently was trending up before, global pandemic, right? And so to your point, it was only going to be accelerated when you're forced into isolation. In the same way, having conversations with former clients, they literally said, hey, we have been able to accomplish and become more aligned as an organization over the past 3 to 5 months, whereas historically, this person had been with their organization for close to 20 years. They said this would have historically taken us 3 to 5 years to make these changes.
Yeah, I guess it's not surprising, and it goes back to that accelerant. We've been forced to learn new things and do things differently and to achieve the objectives that we had prior. And so, it's a very interesting time to be alive. And the other thing that I will say is we're approaching the end of the first quarter, and today is June 9th, and you might say, well, we're approaching the second quarter. No, we're approaching the end of the first quarter of this decade. And I believe, and prior to the decade, I thought the 2020s would be one of the most disruptive decades in human history. Up there with the decade of the 1940s, with the Black Plague, with the World War I, the 1990s. And that was before the pandemic, before, January 6th, before the war in Ukraine. And now I'm saying that the first quarter of this decade will be the least disruptive of the 4 quarters. And you might, okay, well, what's going to happen? But we get to decide what that disruption is like.
Yeah.
Is it positive disruption or is it negative disruption? Now, notice I mentioned the 1990s as being a very disruptive decade, and it was. But it wasn't a negatively disruptive decade. It was actually a decade in which hundreds of millions of people experienced freedom for the first time, right? With the fall of the Soviet Union. And so they got exposed to democracy, and they get to vote, and their economies were able to expand and explode. And look at what has happened to Asia since the 1990s. That's mind-blowing. So we get to decide, Donnie, whether this is positive disruption, do we advance humanity, or do we regress, and is it very negatively disruptive?
Wow. Oh man,
Where are you going with that? Where are you
so
going with
many
that, my
questions,
friend?
my friend. We need to pivot and dig into that a little bit more. And I mean, so what before we do that, can we move a little bit to, because I'm sure some folks are curious, and obviously they can read a little bit about your background and some of those things, but can you talk through, because I think you have an extremely interesting background, but can we talk through just a little bit about your background and how kind of this evolution towards to where you are today, which was driven by you also, running and growing businesses and, all of that.
Sure. Well, to go way back, I got into this field of human resources and work technology back in the 1990s. And I was living in Germany back in 1994, and I got a call from my sister, incidentally, and she said, "I know you're moving back. Do you want a temp job working on our employee survey?" And I said, "Yeah." I had nothing to do, so
Sure.
I knew where I was moving, and it was convenient.
Yeah.
And so this temp job that was supposed to last 2 months or something like that ended up to be, a 1-year gig, and then I turned it into a contracting thing, and then I started my own company, and then I met my business partner, and we started a company that was an employee survey company, so a technology company measuring employee engagement. And it was
Yep.
that moment, around that time, that I realized that work can be something more than a paycheck. That work can actually be fulfilling. So it was really an eye-opening experience for me, and I got addicted to this. I really got addicted to helping people reach their full performance potential, making sure that they were doing what they should be doing, helping them finding their purpose. And so that's what I've been doing over the last 25, almost 30 years.
Yeah. It would absolutely amazing. And it's obviously like this lens of people, I just think is so critical, and it's a big aspect of what we're talking about today. Especially as you talk about accelerations of change and innovation, etc. So can you give us any looks into if the first quarter of this decade is the least disruptive? What is it? What does the future look like? Right? There's a lot of noise now about we need people to come back into the office because our downtowns are empty. But as I referenced it, the shift in values. I had a conversation with Jim Clifton not too long ago, and I know that Gallup is always measuring these kinds of things, and and people are still looking for a good job, like globally, and all of that. But I've just found it interesting that with this shift in values, as people are no longer having to do these really long commutes and are able to spend time with their loved ones a little bit more, and you can just come downstairs, and I can't imagine that productivity has necessarily dipped significantly. So like, where's the disconnect, and what are some of the new things as we think about the future and some of those disruptive pieces in the next 3 quarters? I'm like, we're going to have a conversation offline or bring you back to the show, because I'm sure we could have an entire show just on that.
Well, I'll start off by looking out in the distant future, and then I'll try to bring it back a little bit for us. When I think about the big problems that humanity has to solve, they're global in nature. So let's just take a couple as an example: climate change. So that's the one that's on the top of a lot of people's minds.
Sure.
Our age and younger, certainly.
Absolutely.
So we need to address that. Pollution is another one. Resource scarcity. We're realizing that we can't use water in the way that we have over the last 50, 70, 100 years.
Sure.
So we have resource scarcity that we're going to have to deal with. Data, I think, is one that we haven't really thought about, but the way that we have used data and allowed people to gather our data, sell our data, these are global. All these problems are global in nature. And yet we're aligned in a national governance way. And so when I think out very far into the future, our institutions are not necessarily designed in order to solve the big problems that we have as humanity. And so I can imagine some sort of reorganization, to use kind of like an organization analogy. We need to reorganize in order to address these problems. Because even if the United States went to net zero on greenhouse gas emissions, it doesn't really matter. Because if the other parts of the world, if China, India, the other industrialized nations don't, we're still not solving this problem.
Yep.
And so that's a big disruption that's going to happen. As it relates to work and near term, I'm really excited about some of these changes, because I think we had problems in our cities. Let's use San Francisco as an example, a city that I loved, but I really don't like going there now, or Seattle. The homelessness, the affordable housing issues in these cities, because we have great companies that have provided incredibly high-paying jobs for people, and it's just priced people out of those communities and caused some of these issues. Well, I see working from home as a potential solution for that. So I grew up in a town of 2,500 people, and I don't go back there. I don't go back to that town, but I can see, now that I have a family, I can see the appeal of making a nice living and living there and having a simpler life for my children. That's appealing. But that didn't exist 10 years ago when we weren't working from home. So I think that I'm very optimistic that working from home can potentially save some of our smaller towns and smaller communities, address some of the issues that big cities have, like New York, like Chicago, like San Francisco, LA, etc. And then the other thing that I'm optimistic about is, if we have this reshuffling, this migration, because working from home allows for that, I think there's an opportunity for us to bridge this political divide that we have. If you look at the map, of the country from the last presidential election, it's all red in the rural communities.
Sure.
Well, that's because there aren't a lot of opportunities there. But if we start allowing people to make a nice living in those communities and invest in those communities, maybe those communities can turn around. Maybe we start to have conversations that we weren't having. So that's one thing that I'm very, very excited about and optimistic about, as it relates to this next decade. But it's going to require intentionality. It's going to require leaders who say, go work there, maybe come back to the mothership, to corporate headquarters once a quarter, once a month, whatever. We'll design around you. But those are some of the things that I can see potentially happening if we allow them to happen.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing, and I think you'll appreciate this, I believe, because I've heard it a lot and read different periodicals and other things as I'm keeping track of this, is, remote working appears to have become kind of like a 4-letter word for a lot of leaders who have built companies prior to, right? But it's interesting, because as I've had conversations with other leaders, and I've expressed this interest in, hey, my belief is that companies need to really focus on building what I refer to as decentralized cultures. Everyone is like, yes, that's exactly what we need. But for me, it's just a synonym on remote working. And so it's extremely interesting to see, and this is something I continue to pay attention to, is what organizations are kind of getting it right. And frankly, I'd argue it's basically just the ones that are willing to try, right? And because it's one of the, it has to be, as you think about acceleration. Am I thinking about this correctly? If you think about the fact that you are no longer limiting your organization and the talent pool, if you will, that you can go after based on geographic, whatever that geographic kind of, presence is, and which means that you could literally go after the top talent within those roles wherever they are, literally around the world.
Around the world. That's absolutely right. And in fact, some tools enable that right now and have enabled it for a number of years. As an example, I designed my logo, or had somebody design my logo. And the way that it worked was, I filled out this I went through this software wizard that
Sure.
talked about what colors I like, what design I typically like, things like that. And it enabled me to get access to 100 designers, and they submitted their design ideas.
Really?
And then I chose the one that I liked and paid them $1,500 or something like that, a fraction of what I would have paid an agency.
Sure.
But I got to choose from hundreds of them. And my designer was from Asia, I think from Indonesia.
Okay.
And she and I never talked, but we just communicated through this. I mean, it was a really cool process for me to go through. And then I'm sure that $1,500 was real money for the winner of this design.
Sure.
And, you know, so that sort of thing didn't exist. But yes, to your point, the talent pool and the competitiveness for jobs really expands. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons why I'm excited and also jealous and glad that I'm not at the same time, like all these things, I'm glad that I'm not in the entry level, because when I competed for a job, you know, it was somebody from down the road in Minneapolis who I was competing against, not somebody from Poland or from Kenya or from Brazil.
Oh my
but
God.
That's the reality today. Today's graduates, that's who they're competing against. So it's really kind of interesting. But from a CEO perspective, I want the best talent on my team. Sure. And this is where leadership becomes so important and more difficult than ever. More difficult than ever. You know, maybe there have been crises in the past.
So, you know, speaking of talent, and you just talked about that, and obviously I run a company myself. So and I view that as part of my responsibility, right? It is, and some of this goes to this belief, which I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on this. And I don't want to take us too far down the rabbit hole on this, but some of the historical thinking around talent has been, hey, we have X number of job recs or open roles, of which a lot of folks want to, you know, kind of hold on to. But I believe that some of the reasons behind that are based on the fact that people don't, at their core, really know who their top performers are. And if they had a way of identifying who their not only who their top performers are, but then to be able to go out and duplicate those top performers, right? So that, let's just say that classic 20% that's giving you 80% of the results that you want, then with this, with no longer being limited from a geographic perspective, technically you could go out and duplicate that 20% and not necessarily have to fill all of the roles that you traditionally have filled with kind of, let's just say, people who are not in the 20%, right? And I know you referenced, like, you know, some of those, I'll say platforms that allow you to identify talent and some other things. But are you seeing organizations and leaders begin to think about, you know, talent kind of in that way? So a way that they could duplicate their top talent a little bit more, or just level up the talent within their organization now globally, now that we're not necessarily limited to those geographics?
Yes, there are organizations that are thinking that way, but I don't necessarily think that that's the best way to go about it.
Okay.
And the reason I say that is because just because you have top talent doesn't necessarily mean that the top talent is going to work together. And this is where leadership becomes truly important, is identifying, you know, what talent you need and how that talent can work effectively together. And that's why I think the challenge of leadership has become really, really difficult. It's become more difficult than ever, because if you are leading remote teams in different time zones with different cultures, that's not necessarily going to give you the best results. And so you can experiment with, you know, getting that top 20%, certainly, and there are organizations that do that, but you have to realize that there are going to be challenges and issues with that as well. And some of those issues are going to be, you know, top talent wants to accelerate. They want to get the promotions and, and so what's the right composition for your team? And is it 3 players at the top 20% and then some role players, to use kind of a sports analogy? Just knowing what's going to provide you the best team and organizational results is really important.
Okay. So I know we talked about remote work and some of that, and it seems like you're really, really optimistic about this as kind of like a coming trend. Is there any other trend as we think about kind of the future of work that like you're really, really optimistic about or really, really excited about?
Yeah, certainly. I would say one is this idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I would add belonging to that. I'm so optimistic about it because I've started to really get educated on this and have had some incredible conversations with people who are really into this. And what fills me with excitement is that leaders now are being developed in order to lead through this and create the sense of belonging, and in a way that hadn't happened in the past. And so that fills me with, my mission in life is to help people reach their full performance potential.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we haven't talked about yet is some of the volunteer work that I do, which over the last 30 years, I've mentored primarily young African-American boys.
Yeah.
And I have seen performance potential that has just been completely ignored for 3 decades now.
Sure. Yep.
I know. Education, lack of opportunity, poverty, whatever you want to say about that. Well, imagine if we can include the entire potential workforce and optimize them. What problems can we solve? So this is why I get so excited about that. Yeah, let's develop the talent that has opportunities, but let's not ignore other talent. And so I have seen now 2 generations of leaders, with the new leaders coming into organizations now, really have a sense for how to create a sense of belonging within their organizations. And that's very exciting, right? We shouldn't have as many marginalized populations that don't have opportunity. So that's an exciting trend that I see, and it should only get better.
Yeah, that's huge. That's huge. Well, and maybe we build on that a little bit. And so, if diversity, equity, and inclusion, and belonging, and that sense of belonging, that probably would be, I'm imagining, a practical and pragmatic tip or recommendation that you would make to leaders of organizations as they're building. Do you want to dive in a little bit to what that looks like, and how what is one of the best ways, if your organization is, let's just say, ready, because every organization is not, to kind of begin that journey to make sure that the leaders that you're identifying and or current leaders that you have are creating or moving towards creating that sense of belonging?
It's a great topic, and as I mentioned to you, this is not my area of expertise, but it's something that I've become educated on over the last few years. And just one thing that I think is really important to note is I had a conversation with a woman a couple of years ago. I can't remember exactly when. And I was like, why do we need the B at the end of this? DEI and B. And I said, isn't inclusion enough? And she said, no, Don, actually, belonging is an outcome of inclusion. And I was like, oh, well, that's the light bulb came off. Sure. So I just mentioned that because, that's what we want, is we want to create this sense that you belong with this organization. And one of my guests on the last season that I did on leadership is Dr. Vanessa Dreskat. And she cited during the interview that as many as 60% of people in organizations report having felt excluded or ostracized or invisible within their organization. 60%. So when you are excluded, what happens is in your brain, the same pain receptors that you experience when you feel physical pain are triggered.
Wow.
So your brain, when somebody excludes you, skips you, ignores you, you are feeling pain.
Wow.
And not only that, not only do you feel pain from the individual who slighted you, you think the whole team feels that way about you. So now that's 60% of people have felt that. Now try to do your best work. It's not possible. It's not possible. So this is why creating this sense of belonging is so important. And so I'll just give you a few ideas that I have done over the years that help help get people included in the organization. So the first thing, when we extended an offer at my previous company, when we extended an offer to somebody and they accepted, we would have people on our team connect with the accepting candidate on LinkedIn. Not after they started, but before. And they would say, things like, hey, welcome to the team. We're excited to have you join, that sort of thing. So now this person has made a choice, a life choice, an important choice, and now immediately they're feeling included within the organization. And maybe we would send that person an email like, these are the things that we're working on and things like that. We would ask during the interview, if we knew we were hiring them, we would ask, what's your favorite candy? And they would think, oh, this is some sort of psychological question. No. When they showed up on their first day of work, if their favorite candy was Hershey Kisses, they had a bowl of Hershey's Kisses on their desk. This is just a simple thing like that. On their desk on the first day, they had an employee roster with pictures of every person in the organization, what their favorite movie was, favorite restaurant, where they were born, all of these different things. And they could leaf through it and see, oh, Steve likes Pulp Fiction. Oh, John likes Thai food, and these sorts of things. So automatically they feel connected. And then we would do the same thing for that person, share it with everybody else. And so we were creating these connections. We never let an employee leave the first day of work without doing something meaningful. Talking to a client, because a lot of times we're having people read manuals and things like that, but do something meaningful. The day they're going to talk about your company the most is after that first day. Their mom's going to call them. Their friends are going to call them. They're going to talk to their spouse or their whatever. They're talking about your company on that first day. Oh, it was great. I showed up to work. So what we want to do is, make them feel like they belong, but also turn their enthusiasm for working for this organization into engagement. And the quicker we can do that, the longer that they're going to stay with our organization, the faster that they're going to perform at a high level. So those are just a few really, really simple things that you can do, day one and before.
No, that's significant, my friend. I mean, I've seen research where, literally after that first 90 days, like it's kind of all downhill from there, right?
And frankly, I've done that research, so I know it. And it's really about that. I think about, the new employee experience. People have said, well, nobody will ever be as engaged as an employee as on their first day. And that's not true. They're not engaged. It's like being on a first date. You're not engaged on that first date. You're excited. You might, have a little nervous energy, but that's not engagement. You have to convert that enthusiasm into engagement.
That emotional attachment is definitely not going to occur on day one.
No.
Kind of moving forward. That is absolutely for sure. Well, my friend, I could spend hours learning from you, but as we start to wind down just a little bit, I want to, try and move us in to a place where we can conclude a little bit. Just as number one, as we're thinking about 12 Geniuses specifically, and some of the topics that we've covered today, are there any specific episodes that kind of jump out to you that, our listeners who want to learn more and can go a little bit deeper on, that they can come and follow? We'll be happy to include those in like the show notes and some links for folks to be able to tap into your community.
Yeah, I think there are a few that are relevant for your audience. The first is a trend that I see in the workplace that maybe we didn't expect. We touched on it a little bit, which is mental health. I think that leaders many of them are unprepared to handle mental health conversations. And so one of the great episodes, and it's the third most popular episode, and I have no doubt it'll be the most popular episode that we've ever done, is with Major Lauren Serrano. She's with the United States Marine Corps. She's actually the aide-de-camp to the U.S. Chief of Naval Operations. So she's at the White House frequently, and she's all over with traveling with the Navy. And we talked about when one of the Marines under her command committed suicide, and how she led through that loss, but also led through the mental health challenge that her Marines had. And if anybody wants to learn how to handle mental health issues, facilitate conversations. Now, she worked for Cyber Command, and people have this idea that if they say I'm having a mental health challenge or I need help or something like that, they're going to get their security clearance revoked. And she had to build trust with them and say, no, actually, we will maintain your current security clearance, and we can have these types of conversations. So she normalized those types of conversations. And then she also led 229 Marines through this very, very challenging situation. So that's one that comes to mind. I've had 2 episodes with Dr. Robert Eichinger, and these are on leadership, the brain, and managing lasting change. So I would check out those 2. And then one that I'm really proud of, because I know it helped save somebody's life or turn somebody's life around, is From Active Addiction to CEO. And I interviewed one of my friends of 20 plus years who was a drug addict, and now he's CEO of an organization. A friend of mine called me months after the episode aired, and I hadn't talked to this friend in years. And he said, I listened to that episode, and now I'm sober. And he said, every day I wake up, it's like I'm released from prison. And so I'm very proud of that. And we've done episodes on the future of war, the future of counterterrorism. In fact, that one was really interesting because the guest basically called the January 6th insurrection a month before it happened. And then the future of faith, I think, is another good one. So I think they're all pretty interesting, but for your audience, those are some of the ones that I think are most interesting.
Okay. Well, hey, Don MacPherson, thank you so much for spending a little bit of time with us today on the Only Dream Big pod. So excited, learned so much. Also looking to tap into 12 Geniuses a little bit more. Would love to, when calendars make sense, for us to tap in, because this other 3 quarters that we have in this decade, I am sure that folks, I can already imagine the messages where folks are going to ask, well, what's happening in second and third and fourth quarter? So maybe we can figure out a way to hop on and dive into some of those predictions and things for folks to look out for a little bit more. But once again, just want to thank you for being a guest on the show.
And my pleasure. I'd love to do it again.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. This has been the Only Dream Big pod. I am your host, Donnie Bedney, and we'll see you next week. Take care.